So I am a professor at the law school, and I'm also a senior scientist at the Kinsey Institute. And my research really focuses on examining racial and sexual hierarchies. And the way that I've done that is by looking at the criminalization and policing of sex work terms of my teaching, I teach a class on the regulation advice that looks at these issues in terms of how the Supreme Court has thought about different forms of conduct that we think about as being vice. So, for example, the fact that something like sodomy was criminalized, just a few decades ago, and how the Supreme Court jurisprudence on that kind of evolves over time. As well as, I spent a lot of time, as I mentioned, focusing on sex work in particular, and I've done it in the context of the United States as well as in other countries as well.
Okay, that is so fascinating. And that is just so impressive too.
So I graduated from law school, and after law school, I clerked for a couple of judges. So I worked for a couple of federal judges on the trial court level as well as the appellate court level. And then I went to South Africa and I did a clerkship there for their constitutional court. So it'd be like the equivalent of our Supreme Court. And that was a really interesting experience and led me to want to do some research in South Africa. And so while I was in South Africa, that's actually where I developed my interest in the policing of sex work, because I'd long been interested in policing issues. Before I went to South Africa, I actually worked at the ACLU. And when I was there, I was focused on policing issues, but I wasn't sure what aspect of policing I wanted to do research on. And I heard about these encounters that sex workers were having with the police and decided that this would be an interesting area to look at issues of gender and sexuality and how that translates to policing and regulation.
Oh my goodness. Yes, I actually I'm really excited to ask you a few things. You mentioned policing of sex work and camming for some people is considered sex work. And for me personally, I don't like calling it sex work because they actually don't touch anyone. You know what I
Mhm,
mean? Like
mhm.
it's more of a performance, but I know it is considered sex work and it's legal. So there's not much like policing in the literal sense, but there is a cultural policing. And I would love to get your thoughts on that.
For sure. Part of the issue I think that you have from just the criminalization of even sex work that's not camming is that it creates this stigma around, any sort of work that might be connected to sexuality or, sexual services. And so, what you find in these countries where there's full criminalization, like we have in the United States, or even partial criminalization, like you have in somewhere in Sweden, where it's decriminalized for people engaging in, what we typically think of as being prostitution, but decriminalized for the buyer. You still find this huge amount of stigma around, really regulating people's bodies, and it can be really problematic. And so with the example that you mentioned, how people who are doing camming also feel the results of that stigma, and it could create some negative results as a because of it.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, there are there's a woman I actually interviewed who is an author. She's an expert. She's a sexologist. And she talked about how, during the pandemic when everything was slow, she's also a mother and a wife. And she talked about how during the pandemic, when everything was slow and she wanted to make some extra money, she had the thought, like, what if I could get on OnlyFans, which
Mhm.
really blew up mainstream during the pandemic. And she was like, well, now I have to outweigh the social consequences of doing that for my career and for being a wife and for being a mother when really she just wanted extra income. And it's not like she would be, touching anyone in any way. But like you said, now there are consequences for people who may be in actual dire situations and are needing the financial support for whatever reason. This camming, more than anyone, serves women. It's an
Mhm.
industry that serves women, women that for whatever reason they might be single moms or whatever the case is and need to be at home. That is solving a crisis for them as far as daycare or whatever it is. However, there is such a harsh stigma attached to it that I think it's still repelling a lot of women from doing it. I think people in general from doing it, not just women. Um, and I think it's making, though the members are certainly using it, we know that from the numbers. It's still making them ashamed to talk about it or own up to it.
Yeah, I have this article called Reality Porn that came out in NYU Law Review last year in 2021. And in it, I'm focused on this growing area of, really online sexual intimacy that's developing in different forms. So it might be OnlyFans, it might be chatting, it could be camming, it could be just different things that people are doing, and how we have this distinction between prostitution versus pornography, but we have this growing area. And the unfortunate thing is, with a lot of statutes in many states, the ways that prostitution is defined is so broad that if you had a really aggressive prosecutor or a vice unit, that they could in fact decide that they're going to start regulating this growing area. And I think that's deeply problematic. And as you acknowledge, what's happening online is more of a performance. And I believe that it's entitled to constitutional protection under the First Amendment, because you're really expressing yourself to an audience, even if you're expressing yourself in a sexual way. But I think there are real problems with, trying to criminalize or really police this area, whether formally police it with the police or police it in ways where, in society, you're trying to send out, negative stigmas around it. And, what's interesting during that period of time, as, OnlyFans was growing during the pandemic, there were some feminists who were saying that, in fact, this is just prostitution, and saying that OnlyFans is a pimp. Catherine McKinnon had this op-ed in the New York Times saying that it should also be treated, as being criminalized, which is deeply problematic. Imagine the vulnerabilities that you'd be exacerbating and creating by bringing any form of criminalization. And so I agree. I share your concern in terms of the stigma that is attached to it, and think that this is really something that we need to address as a society. And as you mentioned, most people, the research is pretty clear that most people have used or, have engaged with sexual materials online. Like most people have and do it regularly, right? And so it's also reflecting this hypocrisy in terms of how we're approaching it, in terms of the policies that we're supporting.
Wow, that's really fascinating. And I like how you said that. It's interesting of how we're approaching it, in the fact that we have the numbers and the research that show people are engaging. But at the same time, we're policing it in such a way that we're trying, culturally and in society, that it's sending a message that it's wrong. So it's being consumed, but the same people consuming it are also sending messages that it's wrong. I'm curious, from your perspective, why? Where does that come from? Why are they doing that?
I think, this could have its roots in just American culture. I think, oftentimes sex has been treated as something exceptional, something different. And it could just be, simple sexual puritanism, right? That's motivating this. It's hard to really understand why, but, one thing that I find really interesting and at the same time really problematic is that some of the motivation, some of the advocacy and activism behind criminalization and stigmatizing, different forms of sexual services, even, camming, are coming from feminist movements, right? And there's actually this long history of trying to like criminalize prostitution and really heavily regulate it. Some of it was motivated by trying to preserve the family. Some of it is that, anyone who engages in that work must be a victim or have some issues, and can't really make a determination for themselves. But I think that's, really problematic. And, as we're seeing in this moment with, the Supreme Court holding that, there isn't this right to abortion. When you try to, segment out how we think about sexual autonomy, say that we have sexual autonomy in the context of abortion, but not in these other areas, is problematic because those arguments can come back to bite you. And I think we saw that in Dobbs, that some of those arguments that some feminists were using about, we want to criminalize prostitution, but we want to, not criminalize abortion, came back to them. And it was Justice Alito in that decision actually he used, similar arguments to say why women shouldn't be able to have full sexual autonomy over their bodies.
Wow. So this is getting actually going really deep because yeah, what you're speaking to is this larger issue that I think we're seeing pop up in many areas, but certainly in this area of this rule applies here, but not here because. And it just doesn't work that way. It's going to bite you. Either the rule applies everywhere or it doesn't apply. Um, like you said, we want, the feminist movements you mentioned are saying we want sexual freedom in this way over our bodies here, but you can criminalize those who are using it in this way here.
Mm-hmm.
Or you can, because this whole cancel culture thing, um, which is essentially what happens when you go against what society is saying is okay at the time. That is one of the most, I think, psychologically painful forms of punishment because it casts you out of the group. And as we know, humans are so social in our nature. In our very nature, we want to be part of the group, so to speak, and society at large, feeling like you're in a career where you're being shunned or judged, or you have to be quiet about it because people are going to cast you out if they know, or people are going to cast you out if they know you're using the service. That's a really dangerous game to play. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on how do we solve this? I mean, right, this is the $1 million question. I don't mean to lay this all on you, but I'm curious if you do have thoughts around that.
Sure. I mean, it is a hard question. There isn't a simple answer to it. I guess it's, slowly change culture, change society, right? You keep getting your message out there and communicating with people about, what is really happening. Doing the work that you're doing right now, I think is part of that, process, us having this conversation and people learning that, this isn't really something that we should be stigmatizing. We should be conscious of the fact that we're stigmatizing it. If so many of us are actually, using these different forms or looking at these different materials, why doesn't our policy reflect that? Why aren't we focused on protections for people, like ensuring that, people who are doing camming are, getting whatever they need? Like, why isn't that that equally could be a focus and it's just not. And so really starting to, push people in those questions and examine that. I think, this moment might be an opportunity to do that, right? The feminist movements, must be, regrouping. People are rethinking strategies and tactics, and maybe it's the opportunity to expand and think more broadly about, what we mean when we say sexual autonomy, who's included in that, whose voices have been ignored, and how to incorporate those voices more. And also, beyond that, thinking, how do we stop looking at, ostracizing people, excluding people, criminalizing them, and policing them as a way to help them in some ways, as opposed to, have ensuring that they have their material needs met, right? Shifting to that instead. So, those are a couple of things. I think it's probably a slow process, not something that you see, get an automatic result from, but it's possible. When you think about what's happened, for example, with same-sex marriage over the course of 2 decades, I think 20 years ago, the thought that it would be, legalized and, well, for now, and protected, for now, right. And within that span of 2 decades, would have been unthinkable, 20 years ago. But there was a slow cultural change. There were a lot of things that came into place. There were, things in media. There were TV shows. There were things that, made it so that society evolved to such a point, and then where the court was willing to acknowledge that evolution, that we had people really recognize and have their rights fully recognized. And I think that's a process that can occur with a bunch of different issues that right now feel, hard to imagine that people would fully embrace. But the hope is that if we keep working and pushing and recognizing that there's also people on the other side doing the same, so not relenting, I think we can be in a better place.
I love what you said, not relenting. And you're right. I think that the biggest thing we can all do right now is continue having these conversations and getting facts out there. That's part of why we at Live Jasmine want to interview experts like yourself, right? We're trying to elevate the conversation and put it in a factual light, so we can move the perspective forward. It's a little dated right now, as you know.
To give you a concrete example, the National Organization for Women, so it signed on to this brief. There was this case out in California in the Ninth Circuit, the federal appellate court there. And in that case, there were advocates who represented erotic sexual workers advocating for a right to engage in this type of sexual labor. And they said they had a constitutional right to do so. And they were relying on some of the same cases like United States v. Lawrence, where the Supreme Court held that there is, same cases like Lawrence v. Texas, where the Supreme Court held that there is this right to intimacy between people in same-sex relationships, right? And so they're relying on this case. They're making an argument that sex workers, of all types also have, a right to engage in sexual labor. And so they make this argument and say that therefore prostitution should be decriminalized, right? And sexual labor should be decriminalized broadly, right, including through these prostitution statutes. Now, the National Organization of Women intervened in this case and said that it shouldn't be decriminalized. So essentially arguing for criminalization for people who are engaging in this work. And part of the argument that was made in this, legal brief that they submitted to the court was that, the protections from that other case are really specific and that they really matter in the context of, like monogamous relationships or relationships that lead to childbirth, right? So they say, these are non-procreative, so it's not focused on procreation. And that's why these relationships aren't, allowed or shouldn't be allowed to have the same level of protection, right? So basically saying these aren't intimate relationships. But as you know, at Live Jasmine, there are intimate relationships created in these interactions, right? And so the fact that the National Organization of Women would focus on procreation as a way of defining whether a relationship is legitimate is deeply problematic, right? It's problematic for people in same-sex relationships, problematic for queer people, problematic on so many levels, right? For people who just choose not to have children, right? And using that as a basis, even if it's a brief in appellate court in California, it reflects some of the problems within the feminist movement in terms of really conceptualizing sexual autonomy. So that's one concrete example where, in the fight to, protect criminalization, they're embracing an argument that doesn't work for a lot of women, doesn't work for many women, right? And it's actually harmful and promoting criminalization, which brings a whole host of harms, right? And so that's one example of the, feminist movement limiting its conception of sexual autonomy and creating harm for women who are doing all types of, sexual labor and women beyond that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And it just, that particular argument, to me personally, it just doesn't make sense in the sense that so much of feminism was you actually don't have to have kids and stay home. You got to get out of the house and work, and then to say no, but the relationship is only legitimate if it's for procreation. I thought we didn't need to do that anymore, like it's interesting. You mentioned something, which is that as we know at Live Jasmine, many relationships develop very strong bonds, um, and very intimate bonds, and these people never meet in person. I myself have interviewed many members now, and the one thing that all of them say, they enjoy the sexuality and that's what drew them in, but it's the connection with whoever their favorite model is that has them coming back and spending money, because as we all know, you can watch porn for free online. You can get sexuality on Instagram for free. Like that's available for free, but these members are paying money to connect.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Like that need for intimacy, I think is a real part of the interaction and part of the relationship. And I think we're probably going to see more of that as we spend, more and more time online, and that's how people are forming relationships, intimate connections with each other. I was doing some research in Sweden this summer, and what I've found so far, initially, is that a lot of the sex workers informed me that for many of their clients, there was no sex involved. Like there was no physical interaction that they were having. For a good portion, if not the majority of their interactions with clients, it was about forming a connection. Sometimes it was a date where they were just speaking throughout the date. A lot of times it was just about companionship, right? Having someone to talk to, like emotional connection, right? And I think that's really interesting because it goes against some of the stories, the tropes that we hear, right? It's not just about sex. And I'm not even sure it's primarily about that. A lot of it is about that emotional connection, feeling connected to someone, feeling like you can be vulnerable and honest with someone, maybe someone outside of your world where you can share things about yourself that you can't share with anyone else. Right. And so I found that really interesting, and hearing from multiple sex workers that they're just not having sex during their different interactions, which is really interesting, but goes against, the common story that's told about it.
And that is something I've heard from members multiple times is they'll be like, yeah, my favorite model, I've actually never seen her nude.
Mm-hmm.
I've actually never seen her topless. I'm like, okay, interesting. Because again, that goes against the stories that we tell about sites like Jasmine or sex work at large. I think there's a bigger picture here. And so I'm not by trade a researcher, but I am by trade a journalist and a reporter. And I have been doing so many interviews with experts and models and members. And now I'm able to just gather such a big picture. And that picture tells me that, yeah, I think the sexuality gets people in the door with sex work, but the drive to be there and to come back is so much deeper than what we're talking about.
Absolutely. I agree with that. Absolutely. That it's, often just about the connection, feeling connected. I think, this part I'm not sure of, but like it feel just from, doing the research and, what I've observed, it feels like, there are a lot of people who are just lonely, right? A lot of people who are just like struggling in different ways. I'm not sure how, social media plays into all of this, but that's the impression that I get. And so these people are using these different outlets to get some of the connection that perhaps they're not otherwise getting, which I find really, interesting. And so it's not just about, sex. A lot of it is about intimacy.
Mhm. Yeah. Um, Now I want to be fair. I want to be fair in the interview and ask all the questions. Um, we can start with camming and a platform like Live Jasmine. What are some of the disadvantages you see through that form of sex work?
Through camming, the disadvantages. I'm probably the wrong person to ask this question because I can't really think of any. Like personally, I think maybe other people might be concerned that are people really doing this voluntarily? Maybe there could be concerns about whether it's consensual or not. For me, I don't have that same concern because I think that if that's the case, a company should be able to identify and flag that. The person should be able to report it and have any materials removed. And so I think that could be pretty quickly addressed with, when you have a solid company that's hosting the material. But I mean, I just see a lot of advantages for it in terms of providing people with, a substantial income that otherwise wouldn't be available to them and allowing them to address different situations they may be in, maybe a crisis, maybe not. Maybe it's just wanting to have certain material needs met or have, a different lifestyle than they grew up in. And I think that those are legitimate reasons to do it as well. And so I think there are a lot of opportunities that come with it. And then from the side of members, I think we've touched on some of the benefits for them in terms of just the mental health benefits and feeling the connection and the intimacy.
When I think of sex work, like if we use the example of prostitution, the risk that comes into my mind as a woman is just, am I going to be safe throughout this whole interaction? Is there a physical danger that could happen? That is actually probably the biggest risk in my mind, just as a woman, but that's kind of always on, as a woman, that's always kind of on my mind. Like, am I safe here? Is this safe? Like, um, and that's one of the things that I really appreciate so deeply about the camming industry is that it gives women a safe way to make a substantial income through connecting and sharing their sexuality. And that's another thing. Most of the models that I've interviewed, they genuinely love sharing their sexuality. That's they're sensual women and they enjoy it deeply. Is that like that's another thing in the society and culture? I'm like, is that okay? That there are still women that just enjoy being sensual and sexual. That still exists, and that should
Mhm.
be okay. That should be okay.
Should be. Unfortunately, for some people, it's not, or they're not comfortable with that. And I'm sure that's part of the resistance as well, right? Because, here you have this area where it's primarily women who are able to empower themselves, not rely upon someone else to provide for them, and then get a substantial income, higher income than men in the industry, right? And so that's pretty unusual. And so at the same time, now we have this industry that's, highly either regulated or criminalized. And so, I think that's pretty telling.
I agree. Yeah, and in more ways than one. And
Mhm.
it's like, I can't say for sure, but sometimes I wonder, I'm like, is that part of the problem that this industry is, female dominated and that like you said, they're able to kind of take back a lot of their power. I've talked to so many models that were in an abusive relationship or, in a really bad financial situation with a terrible job, and then they're camming and there's actually doing less work. I mean, it's still hard work, but they were doing less hours and they're making substantially more money in just a few hours. And they can be at home, they can have their kids at home and not have to worry about that. They know they're safe, There's a lot of protection put into place, especially with Live Jasmine and this site, where this site really makes sure that its models stay safe.
Mhm. I mean, that's great. And you're right in terms of the flexibility that it gives to, some people. One thing that, and there's still additional research needed in this, but one thing that some studies are suggesting is that, maybe a number of sex workers or people who are, whether they're doing it, through, traditional prostitution as we think about it, or through different things online, um, a large number may have some disabilities, meaning that sex work gives them the flexibility to deal with if they have like a physical disability where they can't stand up all day, right? Or if they just need frequent breaks, which I find pretty interesting, just in terms of it being able to respond to something that the traditional labor market just hasn't been.
100%. And the same is true for members. A lot of the members I've interviewed either have a disability, or they have an ailment that prevents them from being as social as what they would want to be, or as intimate as they would want to be. They maybe aren't able to have a partner. And so the service is providing them an opportunity to still have intimacy and connection in their lives. And I think we all got a good glimpse of it during the pandemic to a degree where it was like, whoa, I know at the end of the pandemic, I mean, it's still